Welcome to the Big Brown Gadfly. I am El Tabarón de Atenas, and if you know Spanish or if you study Socrates in Spanish, you'll know what that name means. But I'm here with Brittany Klein, who's one of the guests I've had on a couple times, and we just wanted to do a podcast because there's a lot of news flying at everyone, and people in America are very worried about the prospect of war with Russia, which now has gone from being something that was crazy that would never happen to now actually might happen. So the thing that I wanted to put out there that I wanted to with Brittany about is the question of who is actually the bigger threat to us right now. Are we more worried about Russia's conduct, or are we more worried about our government's conduct? And that is important because if in fact the bigger threat to our survival comes from the decisions that are being made by the Biden administration, we have some control over that. We can voice our opinion as citizens and take action here. If the biggest threat is what Russia does, we don't really have control over that. So I'm going to bring Brittany on. Brittany, how are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing pretty well.
Okay, now she has a lot of animals in her house, so you may hear chirping, barking, scratching, all kinds of animal sounds. That's not her. Don't worry. She has a range of dogs and birds that are all involved with her life. They wake up at some point during this. But let me first talk to Brittany about where things are right now. Now, you've gotten some news. I've gotten some news. From what I understand, Russia announced the unveiling of new weapons that they had not used before. The intelligence community was aware that they had these supersonic missiles that go 4 times the speed of sound, but it appears that they have used them and they are deadly. All right. Right now, there's been a lot of images released on both sides that are of questionable authenticity about atrocities committed by one group or the other. I don't want to sort of bank a lot on what those images depict because these may be fake news. We don't know. But it does seem that in the wake of Zelensky's address before Congress, there is now a growing consensus among people in Washington that we should consider a no-fly zone. This is one of those rare moments where Marjorie Taylor Greene and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez agree on something. They both agree that a no-fly zone is a declaration of war. And we basically, if we're going to declare a no-fly zone, all of us in America have to be ready for an escalation that, like nothing we've seen in our lifetimes. We're talking about a conflict that will disrupt every part of our lives. Because if we do go to war with Russia, here's the thing that I want to lay out there, Brittany. I'm going by the words of the leaders in the United States. They're basically saying that the goal of a confrontation with Russia would be to force the ouster of Putin. Now, that means the regime change zone, and there is only so much that you can do with covert operations and spying and having little propaganda things and sanctions. There's only so much that you can do. Eventually, if you were to want to have a regime change in Russia, you would have to place our forces in Russia, which basically means an invasion. And remember what I told you that my professor told me back in 1990. There's 2 things you don't do if you're a superpower. You don't try to occupy Afghanistan, and you don't try to invade Russia. So it seems like we have tried and failed one, and we're trying the other. Now, Brittany, what in your mind is the worst case scenario that's plausible that you could see actually happening with what's going on right now? And feel free to bring in your perspective as someone who has a lot of ties to Israel, because Israel was very much in the news. Zelensky kind of implicitly attacked Israel for not being more forward in confronting Russia. What do you think is the worst case scenario for the world?
The worst case scenario would be World War III. And Zelensky is, I don't know who this guy is or what he is. I never followed comedy in the Ukraine very closely, but he's making all kinds of statements. If talks fail, there'll be a wider war. He's saying that, if the Ukraine was in a member of NATO, this wouldn't have even happened. He knows all good and well that the last thing Putin wants are NATO guns aimed at him
Right.
over the
Mm-hmm.
border.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Right.
in some ways, while they're playing him as incredibly heroic, he's gone rogue. He's not.
Yeah, he does. He does look to me. I get the feeling from him, like, remember Noriega in Panama in the late 1980s, a puppet that then goes off script.
Mm-hmm.
Feels very much like what we're dealing with right now. And again, this goes back to the main issue, which is if that's what's happening, if what's happening is that, the Russians and the Americans both expected him to behave a certain way as somebody who had been installed by a Western power as a counterbalance against the other power, right? If everyone expected him to behave in that fashion, and therefore they expected him to basically flee the Ukraine, and he's not doing that, and he's not giving up his access to the media and the public support he's getting, then we have to look at this as what is the fear, what is the motive, what's the ambition or the panic, the anxiety that American government officials are probably feeling now that they're in a situation that they were in control of and now they've lost control of. It seems as though I think that people in the American side, obviously, they are worried about the impact on America, but I think that for a lot of the people who are in charge of our government, their biggest anxiety is probably going to be their own personal lives, the people that they know, getting exposed, being placed under duress because they have financial dealings that they don't want exposed. I think this is all tied into why the Hunter Biden laptop was finally authenticated by the New York Times, why Victoria Nuland finally admitted that there were biolabs. I think the reason why a lot of these confessions and admissions are coming forward now is because there is a growing sense among people in the United States in power that a lot of things that they could keep secret are now being exposed. And I think that's what's really driving. I think that we have an unusual number of people who are in power in the United States who are driven by a lot of self-interest. They have their ambitions, they have their anxieties, they're afraid of being shamed in the circles that they know, and they are willing to stake the lives of American citizens and the well-being of the whole world just on being able to hang on to whatever they're hanging on to. Because of that, Brittany, I think that we have more to fear from the decisions by the American government than we do from the decisions of the Russian government. Because, everyone's talking about World War III. And of course, the big question is, does that mean that we're going to escalate into weapons of mass destruction? Are we looking at a scenario of nuclear weapons or biological weapons? And I think that ultimately, many of the pundits are wrong. The danger here is not that Putin's going to be backed in a corner and he's going to use nuclear weapons. I think we're the ones who are going to get ourselves in a situation where our leaders have opened up their mouths and they have issued all these strong challenges, but they don't want to actually get dirty and get in the trenches and do the fighting. So they're going to look for a clean way to prevail in the conflict. So far, they tried sanctions, that hasn't worked. So far, they've tried propping up puppets, that hasn't worked. So I think they're going to go to drones. They're going to go to proxy armies. And then if it gets to the point where, really there's no way that they can get what they want, I'm afraid that then they're going to go to weapons of mass destruction. I think that we have more to fear from the American government than we do from the Russian government. Work says, "Hi, brother, spot on." What is it, Brittany? Am I just being unfair to my own country? Am I
I don't
being
think
treasonous?
I think there is always the possibility that if we have the certain weapons at our disposal, we'll use them. I think a bigger problem is that we are unhinged from reality. Again, people don't know the history of the Ukraine or NATO even, and the number of neo-Nazis in the Ukraine. And all these platitudes are coming out like freedom, democracy, and all of this, which sounds very good, but which may or may not have anything to do with the situation. I think Putin's thinking these are people who, you know, are going around saying some women have a penis and, that's the hill they're going to die on. We're really scary. If, you know,
Yeah.
uh,
Well, and I think people it might come across to people like, oh my gosh, does the transgender? I mean, are we going to bring up that in the middle of these global conflicts?
well, no, but it
But
has to be
I would
unhinged from reality.
yeah, that's what I was going to say. I mean, I think that people have to take into account what the rest of the world is seeing. Because remember that most of the world is not going along with the sanctions against Russia. Most of the world has no intention of cutting off their ties to Russia. Brittany and I were talking about our contacts in Africa. Brittany has a lot of contacts in Africa. I have a lot of contacts in Latin America. And people in both parts of the world, they're saying we've been doing business with Russia and China. In many ways, they have a much fonder relationship with Russia and China than they do with the United States. So they're not going to jump to cut off relations with Russia just because the United States says so. And for that global audience, watching American culture become consumed in crazy, I don't want to use the term crazy, but in cultural trends that do seem unhinged from reality, it does make a difference. It does make a difference. I think that people in Russia and in other parts of the world, they are perceiving us as an unhinged country, a country where we have leaders who are either senile and inarticulate and divorced from reality. And then there's masses of people in the United States who are constantly on social media displaying for the world their fanaticism and their total irrationality. And I think, transgenderism kind of is the crystallization of that, but it goes pretty deep. So if you're thinking about how other countries are dealing with us in the middle of this crisis, I think a lot of people are very scared of the United States because we do come across as extremely irrational. The culture matters, the discourse matters, the things that are being said on platforms that are representing the United States, supposedly at its best, these things do matter. Sean Warwick says non-intervention is the way, but the military-industrial complex won't have it. I agree with that. What do you think, Brittany? I think that there are a lot of people in the United States motivated to want to have a long, drawn-out war. Right now, all of the polls are showing the fact that it looks like the Republican Party will do very well in fair elections in the fall, and that means that the Democrats who are in power in the government have every reason in the world to want to have a large, very complicated war going on so that they can claim wartime powers, possibly even cancel elections, or at the very least start doing what Zelensky just did yesterday, which is Zelensky banned most of the opposition parties, and they can start throwing in jail people who just disagree with them with the collusion of big tech. So do you see what I'm saying, Brittany? I think that we have a lot to fear from our own government. Yeah.
I also think it gives let's say, the Democrats an opportunity to talk about their talking, actually.
Right.
Freedom, we're about freedom and democracy and all of that. But you notice, again, a lot of countries do not want to wade into this. Israel does not want to wade into this.
I was surprised. I thought Israel would be the first one because everyone always thinks Israel is like a little pet country, but they're not, right? They're kind of keeping a distance from the Biden administration's position, right?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, they may be forced into it, which I think would be horrific.
Right.
But Putin really does keep Syria, I think, out of attacking the Golan Heights.
Right.
So there is, Putin is not, this insane warmonger.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's hard for a lot of people in the United States to get a full global picture of this. So we have to keep in mind a couple things. We have to think about what the rest of the world sees, reads, and knows about the two countries, about Russia and the United States. The United States used an atomic weapon on civilians. Russia did not. The United States is the only one who did that. Now, some people say Dresden was worse than Hiroshima, but the reality is that in the eyes of the rest of the world, the U.S. is the only country that used atomic weapons on a civilian population. So most people are not immediately going to think, oh, America, good, sweet guy that I want to side with, Russia, bad, evil. That's not what most people go to immediately. The United States has had massive, massive colonial, or whatever you want to call it, neo-colonial imperial interventions around the world. And Russia has as well during the Cold War, but the United States had more, wouldn't you say? I mean, they're generally perceived as more likely to be involved in funding destabilizing governments and toppling governments. And I mean, we've in Latin America alone, we had a Monroe Doctrine. We've intervened in or invaded almost every country in this hemisphere. So most of the world does not begin from the starting point of thinking, the U.S. is warm and fuzzy, Russia is evil, so I'm going to jump and pick a side. So I think, Brittany, what you're talking about in the Middle East, how does that play out in the Middle East? What do most of the Middle Eastern countries think when they see U.S. and Russia?
I don't know what the Arab countries think, but
Right.
from what I can tell, Israel doesn't want to wade into this, and I don't blame them. And I don't think their population wants to wade into this.
Mm-hmm.
They're doing, and I think they should stick to this humanitarian.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Bring out the orphans, bring out the elderly, send in, build temporary hospitals, send doctors, things like that. They don't need to weigh in with planes and weapons and all of this stuff.
Okay, now, Brittany, Greg Olson says, I had seen several articles talking about the leader or prime minister of Israel, whoever it was. I think it's Bennett, right?
Bennett,
was trying to work.
Bennett.
Right, was trying to work negotiations between Zelensky and Putin. So how does that fit in with what you were saying? Because they have waded into it, but you're saying they don't want to pick a side, or they're not trying to lean too heavily on one side?
Yeah, I think they're trying not to pick a side.
Right, yeah.
I think they're willing to mediate. I think Naftali Bennett has tried to mediate, and I don't know, where things stalled or if they stalled, and how.
Right, and part of this, the difficulty is the lack of helpful mediating countries that are available to us, right? I mean, Israel's in a unique position because it has had such a historically good relations with the U.S., and they don't have terrible relationships with Russia. But most of the other countries in the world, if the United States calls them up and says, hi, will you mediate? They don't have a kind of respectful relationship that would make that possible. And the Western European countries now all seem like they've just jumped in. They're more NATO than they are European. So, and then even Switzerland, a lot of these countries are no longer, they've abandoned their neutrality. So we don't have a lot of third-party mediators, right? Israel is probably one of our only options.
Yeah, I mean, I think as of a couple of weeks ago, I think what the Ukraine said they wanted was, independent Ukraine, join NATO, and, sort of something at the border. And okay, so give them 2 out of the 3 and not NATO, because I think NATO is probably the deal buster.
Yeah. Well, NATO is it's a treaty organization, and it's an organization that assumes confrontation. It assumes that
it's a military organization.
Yes. So I mean, it's kind of. I think that Trump was right that it's not even really desirable for us to be in NATO. I mean, they did not perform well in Libya or in Syria or in other parts of the Middle East. And, there's still a huge well of resentment towards NATO in the former Yugoslavian countries because of, there's still depleted uranium left all over after the Serbian intervention of the late 1990s. So there's a lot to worry about there. I think that the most dangerous scenario right now is that the United States, because we have so many loudmouths who in the United States who make very bold statements without really having taken the time to think about it. If you notice, my friend from Britain, he pointed this out, Brittany, and I didn't realize this, but he's right. Biden is out there calling Putin a war criminal, and Boris Johnson is out there insulting Putin, but Putin actually doesn't resort to that kind of language. From what I've seen, he doesn't, and Trump didn't really. I mean, Trump, he made very aggressive statements on Twitter. Maybe I shouldn't try to commit to a position on this, but I'm trying to think. When Trump talked on Twitter, he would make bold statements, but when he met with world leaders, even people who are enemies, he was very classy. You know what I mean? Like he sat down with the North
there's
Korean.
No theater. I mean,
right. Yeah.
There's a script that the Democrats especially have of, dictator, monster, genocide.
Yeah.
Let's see, genocide. They'd say apartheid, but they can't say that.
Mm-hmm.
Next will be they're setting up concentration camps. I mean, they keep saying the same exact things. It's a script, it's theater. And what you perceive as classy in Putin is they're not on the script. Fantasy. They're not.
That's it. They're not detached from reality. That's what's scary about America, I think, because we have been so comfortable for so long and our lives have been so consumed by big tech and social media that I just think the average American, this is a society-wide problem. The average American is detached enough that they will spout out of their mouth very bold claims without being able to back them up and without being prepared to get into the conflict, the brutal physical conflict that might result from what you're saying. It's almost like Twitter has taken over our life. TikTok has taken over our life. And that's what we're dealing with now. We're dealing with the country
it's our moral barometer.
Exactly. And I think that's where the danger is going to be, is that we're going to have loudmouths who really back us into a trap, and then we're not going to want to have ground troops sent in. We're going to want to take care of this in some neat, clean way, like sanctions, or we'll cut off your credit cards, or we're just going to make a lot of bitchy press releases about you or whatever. But in the end, we're still going to want to get our way. Russia's not going to be doing what we want. And then we're going to resort to some kind of long distance, neat and clean weapon of mass destruction, like release the plague in Russia, or launch nuclear weapons. I think that we could very likely be the ones to actually escalate it to the most dangerous level. Do you have any last minute words on there? My son is just breaking in, so I got to get going.
It's always my little pets you blame for noise.
I know, but my son is he's running around there. What anything you want to add in the end?
No, I think I pretty much agree that there is a chance that we believe our own fantasy and heroics to do something very grim and very dangerous.
Yeah. Now, Sean says Ron Paul would have pulled us out of NATO. I agree. It's funny that you bring him up, because that was sort of my gateway drug as I was moving from the left to the right. Ron Paul, I went through my Ron Paul stage, which a lot of people go through. So I agree with that. He also has this to say. He says, we are historically illiterate. Nobody researches or critically thinks anymore. Now, my son is, what is he doing? What you doing there? You're jumping up and down. Okay. Spinning around. Okay. Yes, I think that's a very good point, Sean. And, maybe if we can have a Ron Paul figure who'll emerge, but right now we just got to get through the situation we're in. I don't think we're going to be able to have a savior like that come for quite a while. But I think that we are a country full of people who really do want to be good. And that's one of the best things about America. They really, really want to be on the right side of everything. But the downside of that tendency is
we're lazy.
Well, yeah. And we tend to fall into black and white thinking. And this is one of the things that I said in an article that I think it's going to be coming out in our American Thinker tomorrow. American rhetoricians do very well when they are on the offense, when they're on the attack, and they tend to not do as well when they have to apologize or they're on the defensive because they've been caught doing something bad. I think a lot of times, as a legacy of our Puritan heritage, when Americans have been caught doing something wrong, what ends up sorry, are you seeing what my son is doing, Brittany?
No, what's he doing? I'm sure he's being a good boy.
He's being a good boy. Yes, yes. I think one of the downsides of that is that we don't know how to deal with it when our own side has a lot of flaws and a lot of culpability in the situation. But let's all just pray for peace and pray for good things. And I would tell everyone, keep an eye on those prices. Some of the canned goods that were 50 cents just 3 weeks ago are now 79 cents at the local Walmart. So go and take a look at all the foods you might need to stock up on, because there are probably going to be shortages and price hikes coming very soon. All right? Okay.
All right.
Brittany, do you have anything else to add?
No, I'm good.
All right. Thank you. I'm going to have to try to, you're going to have to log off. We'll be on again soon.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
All right.
All right. All right, Dane, what's going on here? What are you trying to do here?